All right, everybody. We are in the next to the last session of the day. It's been a fantastic morning so far. Session 6A. If your travel plans didn't involve session 6A, then you probably wanted to plane before we close the cabin doors, et cetera, et cetera. So session 6A is titled From Warehouse to Lake Data Pipelines. But what Joe DosSantos is going to talk about really is looking around at a new way of provisioning analytics. And I think that's going to be good. This is actually our second cooking theme show we've had, Joe. Sorry, session that we've had so far on here. But I will turn it over to you and look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Well, I'll aim to be the Julia Child of your dreams here as we go through this. So,
remember, she was a spy, Joe. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But
my name is Joe DosSantos, and I am the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at Qlik, and I'm responsible, like many of you, for the provisioning of data for analytics communities. I'm also responsible for the deployment of data science techniques and internal reporting, governance controls, et cetera. So I want to introduce this concept through a lens that most of us experience in our personal lives, but unfortunately not enough in our work lives, which is how do we actually get data today? And you just heard Qlik's notion of an active intelligence. And this idea that if you want to get news, that is on your iPhone. This is my New York Times app here. It's personalized. My stories are different from yours. It's prescriptive. It sends me alerts to stories that might be of interest to me. It told me the Dow Jones collapsed yesterday, for instance, which was of great interest to me. It's up to date and it's accurate. Like there's this whole notion of validation that happens, hopefully, in your sources of news. And then if you have questions that aren't in that feed, you probably have an Alexa or a Google and it's ready for anything. It gives you reminders. It recognizes your voice. It's easy to use. And what I'd like to do is to introduce first a technical concept and then a governance concept that really helps illuminate how these technologies are being built and ultimately how we can deploy these same kind of constructs within the context of our own organizations. At the end of the day, this is fundamentally what we want. If you think about what's on the left here, it should be fairly easy for us to get the information that we subscribe to. What are the bookings for the month? What's our net retention rate? What is our inventory rate? All of these things are things that should be easy and available for the subscription, and our analytics should really know what it is that we want to know. Now, fundamentally, that is going to answer part of what we need to do on a daily basis. We have a highly repeatable part of our job, but then also we just have our boss always wants to know something, right? We always want to have this answered question for something that's ad hoc. So what I'd like to do is to introduce you to a framework that I think is going to be rather straightforward, but helps us to understand how to govern data to help us to fulfill both of these requirements. How do we get people the news that they want, the descriptive analytics, if you will, and how do we actually answer questions on an ad hoc basis that people need? So, I think that there are pretty much three parts of the digital universe that are becoming ubiquitous in order for us to enable these three things. And they are, in fact, real-time data streaming. So I think that those of us that are old enough to remember, and many of us are, the hopes and prayers that accompanied us getting that batch job done before 8 o'clock in the morning, those are the days of the dinosaurs. We're looking for real-time streaming, data that is available for customers, for consumption, for analytics, real-time decision-making, and that fundamentally is affecting the latency that we're expecting with respect to the data that's there. So streaming becomes a real integral part of how we perform the analytics. The second is governed cloud data stores. Now, if we look at this picture in 1995, we'd probably be talking about big enterprise warehouses. And then we started talking about lakes, and we're going to have this conversation, but we're really starting to move into the generation of the cloud data store. And there are different brand names associated with these different things, but fundamentally what we're looking to do is how can we take advantage of the scale, of the speed, of the capabilities of these cloud data stores that allow us to get these real-time data streams up and running. Gone are the days of trying to figure out how we're going to actually deal with the capacity, the performance of all these real-time data streams. And right now what we're trying to do is to leverage the capabilities of cloud. Now, at the end of the day, though, as data professionals, we know that you can't just put sensitive data or PII out into the cloud and hope for the best. And so what I'd like to do is to introduce this concept of how to govern that in a way that makes us feel comfortable with that data as it's out there. And then finally, all that's great, but let's be honest, nobody gets up in the morning and goes, I can't wait to get my hands on 4 petabytes of data. What they think about is the question that they want to ask. And increasingly, those questions are more sophisticated. We talk at Qlik a lot about the death of the dashboard, which is maybe perhaps ironic for people that know Qlik as a dashboarding company. But at the end of the day, the way we want our questions answered is through the lens of our voice. We want to be able to ask our questions just like we ask Alexa. We want to be able to have specific, discrete questions answered very clearly. I want to be able to ask, what's the capital of Montana, and have it know that it's Helena. And in a context of our business, it's what are our bookings, and we know what a bookings is. By the way, this is also an important kind of governance context. You're hopelessly lost, of course, to do this if you don't know what your words mean. If you don't have kind of a working glossary, you're hopelessly lost to have dimensional access to an analysis of data if you don't actually have an agreement on what those data assets mean in the first place. So in some respects, this is motherhood and apple pie, but it's really important to kind of break these things down, because often in most organizations, these three components may be owned by three different people, but it's important to put them all together. So if you believe in these kind of constructs, if you kind of take a step back, it's always kind of been this way. There's always been a need to get data, step one, amass and organize data, step two, and to make sense of data, that's step three. And what I'd like to do is briefly touch upon what I think is an important understanding of the technical evolution of technologies that have followed us, and then start to talk about the governance implications of that. So if we were having this conversation in 2005, we would be talking about the data warehouse. We would all be talking about how amazing Teradata was. We talk about the advances of the Oracle database, and we'd be really focused around this idea of being able to store more data. And the power of the data warehouse was always really anchored around this idea of truth from many different sources. I could create a common data model. I could create a common data source. And this for us was nirvana. But for a business perspective, of course, it was accurate, but also slow and brittle, and required the delivery of an IT project to get the most basic of insights from. So then fast forward another 10 years, and we were all talking very vigorously about the data lake. And we were gone were these kind of capacity constraints, and gone were the ability of expensive data stores. We could deal with file systems, we could scale out, we could get all the data that we wanted, and this was going to solve that problem. The challenge was we shifted the burden here. We went from a slow population of a model to super fast population, but completely inability to use it. And of course, we all know about data swamps and different things like that, but we owe, the kind of fundamental dirty little secret about the data lake is that very few people of very high skill were actually able to capitalize on the data here. We want to be able to combine data. We want to be able to combine all these different things, but at the end of the day, if you just throw data together at scale, you need a really high degree of sophistication in the user community to be able to make sense. So what I'd like to do is introduce what we think is going to be the brave new world of the 20s, the roaring 20s, if you will, which are the data pipelines. And think of these as highly reusable data assets that are fast and secure, that can be assembled to reuse to answer a lot of different questions. So they kind of split the difference. They are not brittle. They're not widespread and kind of drowning in data. They're purpose-built for the answer of questions. So we're going to go through what this means. From a technical perspective, this means the streaming and assembling of real-time data assets so that they're available on the shelf for your consumption. And what I'd like to do is to kind of shift a little bit to the governance. What does that mean? What does it actually mean to actually deliver this data? So forget about the theoretical construct of a pipeline. What does it mean, and how should we think about it? So I've been thinking about this within the context of a pendulum swing. So, if we were back in 2005 again, we'd have this idea of the data warehouse on one end of the spectrum. It is focused on the finished good. It is focused on quality. And for those of you that are working within the context of supply chain, this idea of, there are things that you put on the shelf that are finished goods, that are available for delivery. They are inspected by number 75. They are ready. They are ready for your consumption. And that consumption requires really limited analytical skills, right? You don't need, I'm putting the bookings here up for your consumption. Well, you know what a booking is. Now you can slice and dice by geography. You can slice and dice by these different attributes. What happened as we started to get really enamored with the concept of big data is we swung all the way over to the other side of the pendulum. And rather than focus on quality, we were really focused on availability. And if you're like most of us, we tried really hard to catalog and inventory our data lakes to stop them from becoming swamps. But at the end of the day, having 1,000 different data models in a lake makes it really hard to consume no matter what you have. The idea here is that we became focused on raw materials. The raw materials, this is a perfect representation of my SAP system. This is a perfect representation of my telemetry data. And as such, I can make whatever I want to it. But you really needed to have superior analytical skills to do that. What I think we have as we start to enter this decade is really the thing that's in the middle, a focus on the semi-finished good. And in some respects, what you're going to see that's going to follow is really an homage to the semi-finished good. You know, I was reminded when I was putting this presentation together that in business school, we were often taught about Benetton's supply chain model. For those of you that are old enough to remember Benetton, it was the fashion heyday of the 90s, and everyone had bright colors. And one of the things that Benetton did is they didn't necessarily know what the hot new color was going to be for that year. So they made all of their clothes in gray, kind of a burlap gray, and waited till the very last minute to figure out what Paris or New York declared the hot new color, and then they would dye their goods to order. Again, this idea of the semi-finished goods rule, I want to make sure that it's available and consumable. All I need to do at the end of it is dye it, right? Semi-finished goods. And for those of you that work in supply chain, again, you know that you need certain things on the shop floor that are really going to be assembled into different packages, and the availability of those semi-finished goods really do a lot to kind of reduce the friction in your supply chain. So I didn't want to miss out on the food metaphors. And so what I thought I'd introduce is this idea of this through the lens of cooking. So let's kind of look through this as a way of thinking about what we can watch. So for those of you that might recall late night television in the 70s and 80s, there was a bit on Saturday Night Live that was called the Olympia Diner. And it was John Belushi, and he would sit behind there, and no matter what you asked, he would correct you. I want a filet mignon. Nope, cheeseburger. And no matter what you ask for is cheeseburger chip, Pepsi, cheeseburger chip, Pepsi. And the orders would come in and go cheeseburger. So no matter what question you answered, we only could have one answer. And this is, I think, how people think of the data warehouse. Everything is super rigid, super structured. I actually want a hamburger. We don't do hamburgers, we just do cheeseburgers. And the structure around data models made it super restrictive. Now, the other side of that is if you are trying to get the data lake, you enter the world of French cooking and Julia Child. And I love this quote from Julia Child, which is learn how to cook, try new recipes, learn from your mistakes, be fearless above. This is the mantra of analytics, isn't it? This is the mantra of predictive modeling that we want all our data scientists to espouse. Try, fail fast. But the reality is that most people just want something that is somewhere in between. Can I make my own food? Can I get something that's reasonable? Can I get something that I myself can do that doesn't feel intimidated? My wife and her best friend used to designate one Saturday every month to spend 6 hours making one recipe. And as soon as we had kids, that ended very abruptly, right? And so the idea is that we're trying to find this middle ground. So one of the things I'd like to do is introduce you to a concept that many of you may know if you're familiar with Italian cooking, which is the idea of semplicità. Semplicità is the idea that 12 ingredients in Italian cooking form the basis of almost everything that you make. And I won't go through them in detail, but you can see what they are. They're cheese, they're balsamico, virgin olive oil, tomatoes, basil. And if you do this, and if you have your pantry stocked with these things, you can make almost anything with just about 4 ingredients and a protein, from lasagna to ossobuco to a nice little caprese salad to a lasagna, right? And the idea here is that you stocked a pantry very simply, and from that, with simple ingredients that are of high quality, you can make a whole bunch of things. And I know that this is a weird metaphor for analytics, but I think it's perfect because just as you have in this other context, you have this idea of a mix of ingredients that are harvested, ingredients that are crafted, and then recipes that can be simply put together that capitalize, that are really anchored around the craftsmanship of these ingredients. And so what I'm suggesting to us as a CDO community is we need to start thinking about the crafting of the olive oil and not necessarily the crafting of the analytic. Because once you've got the olive oil and the cheese, once you've got these basic ingredients, they can be repurposed over and over again to create really meaningful analytics. In the context of Qlik, for instance, we care about bookings, we care about downloads, we care about customer lifetime value, and all of those things are fundamentally anchored around very similar reusable assets, like a booking, like a customer 360. And all of these things, if you have a customer 360 view with proper hierarchies, and you have a bookings view, you can create many, many dishes that will help you understand the behavior of your analytics. So similar with telemetry, if you understand what people are doing, what mouses they are clicking, what sites they are doing, you can understand a lot of the behavior. So our goal is to service the analytics community in a very self-service way by giving them these reusable assets as a service in a catalog, right? That's the idea. The lake had too many assets to be usable by too many of the population. Now what we're trying to do is to focus on these semi-finished goods. Now what that means is that we have an analyst experience, and we're looking for something that is going to be, this data should be easy to understand, easy to use, easy to derive insights. And the idea is that it must be consumable across many different contexts. So what I've just described would be equally usable for BI, AI, voice, NLP, right? These things must be able to be understood. It must be highly, highly reusable, right? And you might increase your list of assets as you're moving forward. You might stock your shelf in your pantry with more things, but I'm not necessarily focused on the end result, the dashboard, the analytic, but actually the data itself. It should be easy to create, fail fast, right? We should be able to create assets and figure out if they're usable, and it absolutely should be of high quality. Now, how does one get that high quality? You know, when we onboard an asset, we have an elaborate process that streams the data in as a snapshot, that distributes that to a data steward, that tags it for any PIR sensitive data, that then gets handed over to an analyst who actually has to respect the value and rules of that PIR sensitive data to create these derivative data sets that are then re-tagged, re-described, re-put into the glossary, into the dictionary, so that they are available as a service in a catalog. So there's a lot of rigidity, there's a lot of process that goes into this. Just like anybody in Italy would tell you, there's a lot of work that goes into creating the perfect balsamico. But once you've created it, you'll never have to create it again. And that's our key point. So that is the end of my metaphor here. And the idea being a real homage to the power of the semi-finished goods. Once we figure out what those semi-finished goods, we can build pipelines. We'll repeatably stream. I'm going to have a bookings number that will be repopulated every 10 seconds. So if someone were to ask, what are my bookings as of right now? That was a repeatable, understandable question that was asked by voice, that could be understood, that has dimensions associated with it, that has a clear data asset that I'm going to slice and dice, right? So there's where the pendulum is swinging. Now, how should we think about, how to enable this? There's a process part, which is clearly here around thinking about our role as a data broker. I think that, if you are a CDO that was put in place in 10 years ago, likely you're from a bank and your role was responsible for data protection. And I think that it's hard to get past a conference like this without kind of paying homage to the work of Davenport and Dallamule and offensive and defensive type of work. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is to navigate from a defensive position that says, I know where my data is, I understand the lineage that was there, to one that sees yourself as a broker to enable an analytics community in a self-service kind of way. How do you make people who are doing data science productive? How do you make people who are doing BI and chat productive? How do you make applications productive? And I think this is our world here, where we have Salesforce and Marketo and NetSuite, and we are working as a way to broker these data pipelines into these analytics communities so that they can enable them based on the skill set that's available in those communities. So what that means, of course, is this very careful balancing act, right? So we are trying constantly to balance the idea of security and speed. And anyone who says that this is not a particular kind of analysis is kind of deluding themselves. And I think that what happens is, generally speaking, our community tends to err, I think, a little bit on the side of security, and your technical community tends to err on a little bit of the side of speed. And we need to find that right balance. And I think that the power of the data pipeline is that if you have a repeatable, reusable asset that you understand and can tag, that you wrap governance processes around, that are reusable, that you access, that you implement role-based security around these assets, and that are domain-based in real time, all of a sudden you have a modularity that you can manage that really helps one to balance this idea of speed and risk. So, so what I'm suggesting here to you is that breaking things down into smaller pieces, into reusable assets, helps us to do this balancing of speed and security, helps us to designate very specific data stewards into the process, and helps us to provide a clear path for enabling those pipelines in real time. And I'd be remiss, I'm contractually obligated to say, by the way, this is a solution that Qlik can enable for you. We have both the capability of streaming, deriving real-time data. We have a catalog that can enable that, so it enables people to find that data. And we have an analytics platform that operates both in conversational speech, natural language processing, and then finally some action, because at the end of the day, knowing something's pretty useless unless you're actually triggering an action within the context of doing that. So if any of this conversation has resonated with you, I would encourage you to take a look at Qlik.com. There is the ability to actually do a trial on our Qlik SaaS site. So that you can take a look at it without too much interference. It's pretty easy to get your hands on within the context of SaaS. But this is something clearly that we are trying to enable with our SaaS platform. But I'm a practitioner, and this is what we're trying to do ourselves. And I'm responsible for the group that is often affectionately called Qlik at Qlik. Now, just to kind of wrap this up with a couple of themes in terms of summary, I think that we really need to start to remember that businesses want analytics that feel and work like their consumer experience, right? So that's our starting point. If we were meant to create dashboards for the rest of our life, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But if you start off with the principle that we need to have a much more dynamic interaction with our consumers, that's a key point. And if you embrace that thought, what you wind up is this idea that there is power in the streaming and real-time dissemination of these semi-finished goods. And that third, that the CDO has to have the role that is part technology, part politician, and part psychologist, that helps to understand what those data assets are, how to understand their reusability, think like a supply chain manager and not like a data person. Think about how these assets can be repositioned, reused, like an Apollo 13 scene, and put to use and reuse, so that we can enable different kind of business constituencies. And I'll often say that the first thing one needs to do is really understand the utility of the business scenario, right? We need these use cases that kind of illuminate our path. Once we start off with those use cases, we can start to figure out which data we start to see over and over and over again being required. And don't let people just kind of throw out as, I need telemetry data, right? What they really want to understand is a certain kind of behavioral patterns, and we can use it as a teaching exercise to help build the semi-finished goods around usage or around behavioral patterns around retention, different things like that. So I use this as a cheap way to help to inform the governance aspects to create these reusable assets, and also to protect the assets in question when there's an increasing demand for real-time availability of those assets. So with that, I thank you. And if you are interested in contacting me on LinkedIn, I am, like I said, a practitioner. I'm a big believer that we're all in this together, and we are all trying to solve more or less the same problems. You've probably solved the same problems that I haven't, and vice versa. I blog a lot, and I'm on Twitter. So by all means, reach out to me. But I think we've left 5 minutes or so for any questions, if you might have them.
Maybe even a little bit more time, Joe. Thank you for a great presentation. Really appreciate it on here. Let me jump right straight to the questions here. This is one that came in from Uma. How are companies adopting the concept of a single unified data visualization platform and tool? Is there a huge cost impact benefit? Excuse me, I'm going to read that again. Is there a huge cost impact benefit to this approach?
Yeah, I think the way to think about this is, first of all, let me say there's a right tool for everything, right? And so there might be good reasons why you might need to have different kinds of analytical tools. But of course, if you can consolidate licenses, and of course, if you can consolidate the way you're thinking about having one analytics tool as opposed to 65, you're going to start to save some money. So before I was at Qlik, I was at TD Bank, and that was one of the kind of pressing matters, was to try and figure out how we could reduce the cost of delivery of analytics. And you're certainly better off if you can start to rationalize some of that cost.
Of course, it's always a trade-off, isn't it, Joe, that, you have certain needs, but at the same time, it's like the old Mac versus PC debate, right? Remember, we only want PCs in the room, so nobody that wants to do anything with a Mac can actually have a role here. It's a little bit different in the data environment, isn't it?
Yeah, and I do think that the world is changing very fast, right? And so, we wouldn't have had a conversation around neural networks 3 years ago, and now it's kind of the fad. So you're going to need to stay flexible. And so, what I think is a no regret move is it's important we kind of have a saying around Qlik that we want to standardize the back end so as to liberate the front end. And so if you don't have kind of your arms around what your catalog of data is, what it is, where you can find it, who can have access to it, and under what circumstances, it's really hard to enable any kind of choice around your analytics tool. And then you just wind up with a whole bunch of shadow IT going and doing their thing anonymously. So for me, it feels like a no regret move to invest in a centralization of the back end. Now, on the front end, I think that there's certainly an advantage to standardize as much as you can. But of course, there are certain types of things that you're going to need to do and want to experiment with, especially as the market changes very rapidly.
Absolutely. Great advice on that. Next question here is, how often should we iterate on the data simplicita ingredients once we have a perfect recipe for the cross-functional application? Since data sets change over time, what's the iteration timeline for ingest, QA, and reapplication? And several of those terms, Joe, are in quotes. So I'll happy to parse that, or if you think you got it, give it a shot.
Oh, I got it. I'm living this actually right now. By the way, I'm completely distracted by the fact that the Joe DosSantos down in that picture has pre-COVID hair, and the Joe DosSantos live has post-COVID hair. But anyway, so we are going through a process right now where we are upgrading our Salesforce environment from Salesforce Classic to Salesforce Lightning. And as a result, all the data model structures are changed under the covers. And as a result, our ingredient, which is bookings, and our ingredient, which is the forecast, are all thrown into a tizzy. And so, so I think that there are macro changes that one needs to absorb. And what we've had to do is to re-onboard those data assets, remap them to the things that we want. And that's a situation in which the back end has changed, but the definitions have not changed. But there's work involved in all those different things. For us, it usually takes us, so we have replication technology that makes it pretty easy to get the data available in a couple of days. And then the tagging usually takes another week. And then it's usually about 2 weeks before those things are kind of fully through and in the hands of kind of a developer to do something with, right? So you need some patience there. The flip side, other example, is where the definitions themselves change. And I think that's some of the examples that you've said, like, I actually don't want to think about lifetime value, including this aspect. I'd like to exclude that aspect. And so then what you've done is you've changed the recipe as opposed to changing the data itself. So what we've tried to do is to say there's a systematic 4-part step: onboard the data, tag and organize the data, transform the data into these reusable assets, and then retag and secure those new assets. And so what we'll do is with each kind of new requirement, we'll evaluate whether or not each or all of those 4 things need to be touched, and then to go through an onboarding process for those data assets in question. And not surprisingly, once you get into a rhythm with this, you have a new prioritized list. You can't do everything at the same time. You've got demands of your data stewarding community. So there is definitely some time and work to do that once you've got the process in place.
Super. It's kind of like practice, 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 right?
Yeah, it's like, you know how when you practice law, you never stop practicing.
There you go.
That's like that.
I'm not a lawyer, so I won't say anything more on that subject. But so here's the next question. Joe, how often do you find companies have partly built the ideal solution, but because it's cross-departmental, no one group wants to solve this for everyone? What's a good way to build consensus and funding for data pipelines that serve multiple constituents in unevenly weighted ways? Oh. And then they did have the politeness to say thank you for a good answer, because that's $1 million answer right there, right?
Oh, so that, in my opinion, when I talk about the need for the CDO to be the psychologist, this is what I mean. I live this every day as well. So we live in a particularly siloed organization where sales does its own thing, marketing does its own thing, services does its own thing. And as a consequence, when it all comes together, it becomes remarkably difficult. So my approach to solving this problem is the first thing that I did was create a steering committee that had direct reports of each of the people in the executive team. And so then I locked them in a room and did a workshop, which I would actually recommend. Qlik offers this for free. It's a value engineering exercise. And you start, let's not talk about data. Let's talk about analytic impact. Let's talk about problems that we as a company are trying to solve. So at Qlik, for instance, we are trying to, we care deeply and passionately about retention rates. We care deeply and passionately about the growth of our SaaS business. We care deeply and passionately about the conversion of maintenance to subscriptions, et cetera, right? And what we're able to do is to get all of these things onto a board. There's a methodology behind this. And what results is this interesting kind of 2x2 matrix, where one axis is how important and vital would this be to be driving, that you could stand in front of the CEO and say, we're doing this problem, he'd be very excited about that. And the other axis is how achievable is this? What's the complexity of delivering these different things? What you wind up with is this kind of upper right-hand kind of magic quadrant type of a thing where you have 4 or 5 things that jump to the surface. That's exactly what we did. So we then set up analytic pods that were cross-functional. And then I did a monthly update to the CEO and said, this is what we're working on. I'm going to give you an update once a month on these 4 initiatives. So that's how I built consensus, was to try and get them out of their day jobs. Once you get people to do their own self-service, functional, local stuff, that's easy. But getting people to care deeply and passionately about numbers that cross across, you have to figure out the use case. So we started with the use case, then went into the analytics, then went into the data assets that we required to produce those analytics. And that seemed to be a useful, impactful way of doing that.
Absolutely. And it looks like you got some of it on the board back there, right?
I do.
There you go. There you go. All right, next question. This is another one of those, I want you to split the baby here. So do we invest in building the enterprise data lake house from scratch, or migrate and mature the data warehouse to cloud?
Oh, what an interesting question.
Isn't it?
So I think the answer to that has to do with how satisfied you are with the assets that you've created, right? So one of the things, let me kind of take a step back and say, I believe that, we talk about things like Snowflake. We call them data warehouses, but we call them warehouses because they kind of function like with a SQL layer, right? Like you can inspect it and run a query like you could in your old-fashioned warehouse, and that feels like it. Does it mean it can't service like a lake? Well, of course not, right? So in some respects, we're talking about, I would start with this idea of anybody, all of us have this idea of raw materials, semi-finished goods, and finished goods across our landscape. And the idea is, do you like them? Because if you like them, keep them. And if you don't like them, recreate them. And so I hope that one of the things I don't want to get across in this is the idea that the concept of a lake is dead. Right? Because it's not. Effectively, you need these big repositories to hold on to data, especially kind of temporal data that might disappear, like sensors and different things like that, because you'll need to physically store them, right? So what I would say is, generally speaking, you will find yourself in a position where you kind of like some of your raw material data. You might find yourself in a way where you kind of like some of your finished good material. So I think that there's an idea of trying to figure out what you like. The re-architecture of these things is no joke. Right? So I don't want to trivialize how difficult it will be to re-engineer and re-architect these semi-finished goods if you already have one. We're kind of using some DBT scripts within the context of Snowflake to do some of these things, and it's work. And so if you already have something, use it. And I guess the key takeaway that I would say from that perspective is your catalog should be platform agnostic. Your catalog should be able to help you understand where your data is. And irrespective of what platform it's on, semi-finished, finished, or whatever, get it. So I guess I would fundamentally advise about trying to recreate the assets that you already have, just because of the technical debt, because you already have enough headaches on your hand. You'll eventually get back to that, right? I think it's inevitable that someone's going to say, why is it that you have 3 different warehouses here? But I think it's really hard to put points on the board that way. I think it's really hard to energize the business around the idea of cost takeout. So kind of the idea of replatforming your 35-year-old Teradata will be fascinating to the CIO, but not probably all that interesting to the head of marketing. Whereas if you can kind of give the head of marketing something new, that will keep your your support among the executives there for you as you do that.
It is critical to make sure they are supportive of it, because of course they are confused by mainly some of this. And I know one of the things that Qlik has done is work very hard in the area of literacy around there. And so we don't actually have a question on that, but I just want to acknowledge your efforts have been very, very strong as a company in that area, and that's been very helpful. I think we've got time for one last question here. We'll see how it goes, but this is Michael says, we've taken a similar journey. We built a large data lake and are starting to set our strategy around real-time pipeline opportunities and cloud. Any advice you would recommend as you begin the journey?
I would say that the advice is get your standards, take a step back and get your standards and figure out how you think the whole thing is going to hold together and try it out very quickly and simply, right? And so I think that sometimes what happens is there's two paths. You have everybody try something, which usually results in chaos, or you have this year-long enterprise architecture discussion around how it's going to work in perfection. What we did is we tried to do something in between, which is we had the basic ideas. We wanted these standardized objects. We kind of knew what technology we wanted to use. We're clearly going to use our own technology. And we started to prototype that with some very specific data sets and quickly realized that we had tons of holes. And so I think that that's what I would say is you will have tons of holes. Find out the holes first and do that by prototyping what you think is mostly right with the principles that you have on place. So get yourself a loose picture of what you want to do. Get yourself an executive sponsor for a particular asset, an analytic that you think is going to be worthwhile. Prototype quickly and figure out where your holes are and build from there.
Super, fantastic advice. And that's just the kind of thing that we expect from this particular event, is very practical stuff. You guys can reach out to Joe and follow up with some of these questions, because I know that he didn't have a lot of time to respond, and he's clearly got a wealth of expertise that he can bring in here. But we're going to go ahead and close this session down now. Joe, thank you so much for taking time to share your knowledge with us and for helping the event here in general around all of these.
One last plug. You mentioned the data literacy, and I wanted people to know that that's a big deal for Qlik. And we have a lot of free assets. So if you are thinking about how do I make my community smarter around the usage of data, the dissemination of data, just Google, come to qlik.com. The data literacy is all free of charge and easy to access. And we're really just, our mission is to try and build a data literate world. So have at it.
And I'll second that, because I cited a whole bunch of your literature in my new book on data literacy. So we'll see how that comes out in a couple of weeks. Joe, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.